So this week there are a few things in chapter 25 that have my attention. And so we have just left where Isaac has found his wife. And we are at the point where it's talking about Abraham and his passing. It talks about some of his other children he had with a concubine, which we want to always remember that God fulfilled the promise through the child of promise, not through the child of their own strength. And so we know that Ishmael was something they tried to do on their own. We know the other concubines who he takes on Keturah is something they did on their own. But the child of promise was Isaac. And so he was the one that would receive the blessing. And so it shows that Isaac and Ishmael came together. They buried Abraham where Sarah was buried. So this is honoring that this is the relationship that they had and that he wanted to be buried where God made that promise to him. And so it goes on, talks about Ishmael. We see that Ishmael was also blessed, like God promised Hagar at the well, that Ishmael would be blessed and he would be a father of 12 tribes. So he has 12 children who become the tribes that settle to the east. And then we talk about Isaac, and I love in verse 21, it says that Rebekah was barren. And so we see this role playing out again, just like with Sarai. She wanted to have children, but couldn't have children. Now Rebekah's in the same spot. And I think about that because Isaac knows, I'm sure, you know, when old people start to tell stories and they tell them over and over again, I'm sure Isaac has heard the story of God's faithfulness and how he was born, and he heard about the waiting, and he heard about God's promise, and he knows that he's the son of promise. So he knows that God has to fulfill the promise he gave to Abraham. And so I love this in verse 21, it says, and Isaac prayed much with the Lord for his wife because she was unable to bear children, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, became pregnant. Now, what we don't realize, it's not until verse 26 where you see it was 20 years before she had a baby. It was not like, oh, we haven't had children in 5 years, we're going to pray. 20 years. So he had a much waiting game, just like Abram and Sarai had. And so he had to wait 20 years for the fulfillment. And I love that it says he prayed much, meaning this was something he was fervent. He constantly talked to God. He constantly reminded God of his promise. And I think that we can be so reminded of that. When God promises something, we can remind him. We can have conversations with him and believe him until we see it done. It's not in our own timing. We don't understand why sometimes it's a wait or what it may be, but when God makes a promise, he always fulfills it. And so I think it's interesting in verse 22, Rebekah finally becomes pregnant, and she's having such a hard time in her pregnancy that she asks the Lord, if it is so that the Lord has heard our prayer, why am I like this? And I think that sometimes we get like this. We ask God for something, and then when it doesn't go exactly how we thought it would, we're like, oh, why'd you give me this? And God's sitting here saying, didn't you ask for this? Isn't that what you wanted? So I find that funny that I can relate to that. And so in verse 26, we see that it is, in fact, 20 years later that the two boys are born. I think it's interesting that God names them before they're born. There's only, I think it's 8. I may be wrong, but I think it's only 8 people in the whole Bible where God has named them before they're even born. And so he told them, you're going to have Jacob and Esau. And so we see, I want to jump down then. So we see that there is this unhealthy favoritism that's happening between Isaac and Rebekah and their children. Isaac favors one, Rebekah favors the other, and we can see how unhealthy that is. And so as parents, it's something to keep in mind that we must fight the urge to become like that in any way, because the fight that goes on between these two boys goes down through the generations and becomes something of wars even today. It's due to the two the lineages of these boys. And so I find it interesting in verse 31, we find where Jacob and Esau are out here, and Jacob desires the birthright. He knows what it is. He sees the value in the promise that God made to Abraham. He sees the value in what it brings, and Esau despises it. In verse 34, we see that Esau then sells his birthright to Jacob. And so for the most part, it's kind of like, is that possible? Can you sell your birthright? It is a possibility. It's something you could do in this time. And he sells it for a bowl of soup. And I think it's David Guzik that says it. He says, when we despise God's offer of salvation because we don't want to give up our earthly pleasures, we are making a terrible trade. Just like he's making a terrible trade for something that was just for a moment. He gave up a lifetime of blessing that God had promised him. And so you can see that Jacob wants it. He desires the things, whether it's a good desire, a godly desire, or a greedy desire. He values the promise of the inheritance that God has promised, and Esau despises it. He thinks it's worthless. He doesn't, a bowl of soup is better than that. And so I just think that sometimes we can get drawn in where we think the things of the world are worth the trade of our salvation, or worth the trade of living a life for Christ. And so we can't get tempted in this. We see that Esau regrets this, and it plays out a little bit later where the blessing is taken from him. And so we'll talk about that later, but don't trade temporary pleasures, temporary things for the things that God has in store for you, has promised you. So today, think about that as you go through your day, that God has promises for us, and we don't want to trade them for something petty or of this world. So join us next time when we dive into chapter 26.